Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, mother and daughter, both viewed as traitors for a time, Anne Boleyn losing her life but Elizabeth getting her liberty and going on to become perhaps England's most iconic queen. Their relationship as a duo, as mother and daughter, is one that's seldom explored, and yet both Anne and Elizabeth showed quiet signs of support for each other, even though mother and daughter were ripped apart following Anne Boleyn's execution when Elizabeth was yet 3 years old. Next May, in May 2025, I and my colleague, Dr. Sarah Morris, are running a tour from our historic tour company, Simply Tudor Tours, titled Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens, taking in many of the sites associated with these two iconic women from history and meeting experts and reenactors along the way. Today, Sarah joins me for an informal chat, really, a bit of a gossip, all about the relationship between mother and daughter, and we share some of our own feelings and opinions on these two megastars of British history. So buckle in for a fun, light-hearted but enthralling chat about perhaps the most iconic mother-daughter duo of all time. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 47, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens, with me, Adam Pennington, and Dr. Sarah Morris. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Sarah Morris. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you very much. It's been an intense day, but I'm kind of girding my loins to dive back into the Tudor stuff. Complete switch, because I don't know whether your listeners know, but my other main job is as an executive coach. So that's what I've been doing all morning. And now I've suddenly got to go back 500 years and try and remember all my Tudor history.
But it's the better stuff, right?
I hope so, yeah.
So today we're really having, rather than it just being all on you, we're just having a discussion really about some of our feelings and some of the stories that link Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, her daughter Elizabeth I. And the whole reason really for this is that, again, something people may not know about you and I is that we created a tour company, and we've got a tour happening in May 2025 called Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens. And because of that, we thought it would be good to have a discussion just between the two of us for everyone to hear more about that, and also some of the stories that are sort of peppered throughout and some of the aspects of Anne and Elizabeth's story that are seldom explored, I guess. Yeah,
and linked to the places we're going to be visiting along the way.
Absolutely, yeah, because there's quite a few. And I think that's one of the things about... It's funny, isn't it? Anne and Elizabeth's story, despite them being mother and daughter, is kind of seldom explored as a conjoined story, because obviously, you know, Elizabeth was made an orphan. Well, not an orphan, but she lost her mother at a very young age. So their story really doesn't have a lot of crossover. But there is a lot to discuss about the two of them, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we often talk about, don't we, about Elizabeth being Anne's greatest legacy, and that's probably as far as people go. But I think we were inspired to look at the stories together because, of course, Elizabeth is a Boleyn, a half Boleyn, and therefore she has roots with the Boleyn family up there in the east of England in Norfolk, which is, of course, where we're going to actually start the tour. Yes, we're getting out of London, aren't we? We're going deep into the sticks and seeing some of rural England and going to explore, the early Boleyns, which I'm really looking forward to, because let's face it, the UK, I know you're a Londoner and you may disagree with me, but I'm going to say that the UK is far more than London.
Oh, of course it is. Absolutely. I mean, I'm a Londoner, but my dad's from Yorkshire. So, you know, I've got some northern blood in my veins as well.
It
does mean I'm a staunch Yorkist, ovs, rather than a Lancastrian.
Yeah, I wonder if, you know, the Yorkist spoke with a Yorkshire accent, you know, I up, lad.
There was a.
They're getting you to London.
Yeah, I know. Well, I do know that I think the Tudors spoke much more akin to sort of a northern accent. I could be wrong, but I seem to recall reading somewhere that the closest we can get to a Tudor voice would probably be Geordie, so the accent of someone from Newcastle.
That's really interesting. And actually, gosh, there is a guy that I came across on YouTube, and he does like speaks in English right back from medieval England. So he'll read like 30 seconds of a script.
I know the one. He's got a YouTube channel.
And it goes forward. Yeah, and it leaps forward, and it's so interesting to listen. And I say, so yeah, if you want to, if you're interested, guys and dolls, listening to this, you might want to look up on YouTube and try and find this guy. I can't remember who he is, but I found it absolutely fascinating.
I did it. I know exactly the guy you mean. He's got a video on YouTube where he reads a passage of English, almost from, I think, like the 12th century, and it jumps sort of every 50 years or so, and just how it changes over time, and it is remarkable, the difference.
It is. It really is remarkable. I'll have to go and dig that out again now. I've reinvigorated my interest because it was just so fascinating. Yeah. And that may be why you remember because it did have a very different sound.
Totally. And one other little sort of, I remember Susanna Lipscomb explaining once, I can't remember where, but obviously when Anne Boleyn had that debut at the Tudor Royal Court and she played the role of Perseverance, I remember Susanna saying that the Tudors pronounced it Perseverance, which is something I do remember.
Yeah, interesting. Well, there you go. So anyway, we are a little bit distracted, but we were heading to Norfolk, I think.
We're heading to Norfolk, yes, for the start of the tour, and Blickling Hall. Now, you're our Tudor site expert. Tell me about Blickling. I believe it was the house that we see now isn't one the Boleyns would have known, but is on the plot that they would have known? Yes,
absolutely. And in fact, there may be more of the Boleyn house that still exists buried in the current house than we actually previously thought. So if you go and see it today, you will see a largely Jacobean manor house. It was bought in, I think it was 1620 by Henry Hobart, who did a huge amount of redevelopment. And that was when the Boleyn home was redeveloped and upcycled to the latest Stuart fashions. And then I think, again, it was subject to further redevelopment. I think it's in the 1760s. So, yes, what we see now really doesn't look like a Tudor manor house, but it does incorporate some of the fabric of the Boleyn family home. And that home was purchased by Geoffrey Boleyn, who, of course, is really the Boleyn that propelled the family from being yeoman farmers to the stratosphere of Tudor society. From his success in London as a mercer and then Lord Mayor of London, he became a very, very wealthy man, and therefore was able to come back to the county of his birth and purchase the manor of Blickling from, I think it was Sir John Falstaff, who was his neighbour. And
is he sorry to interrupt, but is Sir John Falstaff also the inspiration behind Falstaff in Henry V?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah,
I think he is, isn't
I'm not super familiar with Henry V as in the Shakespeare play, but I do believe, yes, that is his character and the inspiration behind it. So yeah, they built a lovely a fair Leyland describes it as a fair manor house, which probably means it was built of brick and maybe had some of that diapering pattern. If you want a comparable house, there is another house nearby in East Barsham which still survives. Oh, it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And it is thought that perhaps the Boleyn Manor House looked something akin to that. But more than that, there are no drawings or floor plans of the original house. So we don't know much more about it, sadly.
So annoying, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
Did they not know that 500 years later, there'd be lots of people who would like to see the original house? So selfish.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And that's why I'm drawing plans of my own house in case somebody 500 years in the future.
So somewhere else we're visiting is Norwich Cathedral. What are the links with the Boleyns there?
Well, Norwich was the county town, still is the county town as far as I'm aware, of Norfolk. And in the Tudor period, it was hugely important I think it was the second largest city in England after London. Again, a huge trading city with a vibrant sort of cloth trade, wool trade, which meant there were quite a lot of wealthy merchants. And of course, the Boleyns fitted right in there, and they had property, in Norwich. But specifically, Norwich Cathedral is the burial place of Anne who was who was Anne Boleyn's, I think it's great grandmother. I always get my number of greats mixed up, but I think it's her great grandmother, and Anne whose son William, who of course therefore is Anne Boleyn's grandfather. They were both buried close to the high altar in the Boleyn Chantry Chapel. And although, sadly, later redevelopments of the cathedral have meant that chapel has largely been disassembled, and the tomb ledger of Anne Who was actually moved from its site into the kind of the ambulatory behind the high altar. You can still see it there, but it's been stripped of all its brass, unfortunately. But when Elizabeth visited Norwich on one of her famous progresses, I think it was in the 1570s. I think it might have been 1570. Was Kenilworth 75 or 78?
75, I think, from memory.
So yeah, so then it's 1578. She went to Norwich. I'm fairly sure, and we know that she stayed in the Bishop's Palace, which still is part of the fragment of the building, is still adjacent to Norwich Cathedral. I think it's a school now. But Elizabeth heard services in the cathedral, and we know that she had her throne set up directly opposite the Boleyn Chantry Chapel, and she would have seen all the kind of heraldic emblems of the Boleyn family surrounding the apse in that kind of I think it's presbytery, isn't it? The area that's just around the high altar. So we know that it definitely had a connection with the early Boleyns and also with Elizabeth. That's nice because we see the two coming together, and it's kind of one of those few times, don't we? We know Elizabeth didn't refer to her Boleyn relatives, particularly her mother, that much. So it's quite a nice little connection, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think it's also one of those sort of a bit, and we'll come on to this in more detail later, but it's one of those things that also maybe gives us a slight indication about how Elizabeth, in her own quiet ways, tried to celebrate her mother and her mother's family and what is ultimately her own family. I think that was probably one of the ways that she was able to slyly show some love to 50% of her own DNA, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll come on and talk about this, but it's always I think it's very bewildering to many of us as to why Elizabeth didn't make more of her Boleyn family or have her mother reinterred somewhere more appropriate. But perhaps we'll save that for when we come further on in the tour and visit London.
Definitely. That's something I definitely want to discuss. When did the Boleyn sort of up camp from Norfolk and head towards Hever?
That was around 1505 with the death of Thomas's father. He obviously inherited, being the surviving eldest son, and Hever was one of the Boleyn properties. And I think people guess that actually it's made a suitable home because it was close to the London Dover Road. Thomas was at court. He was always he was a diplomat, linguist. He was serving the crown. It would have been much more inconvenient to have to make your way down from rural Norfolk to either attend court or travel overseas. So Hever became a very convenient location. It was also a very private location. And I think we do need to just mention this fact that Hever was just one of several properties in the Boleyn portfolio. And I think it's easy to think, because it's the only one that survives, that was it. That was where they lived the whole time. And, they had other properties. And they definitely, I imagine they would have moved around like any Tudor family of the age.
Yeah, everyone else was pretty itinerant, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm trying to think.
I suppose it's close I suppose its close proximity to Penshurst and Knowle would have been advantageous as well.
Yes, I guess so, because at some point Thomas became the keeper of Penshurst, didn't he? And so, I mean, maybe that was partly because he had the base at Hever. So, but yeah, for later on, when of course much further on in the story, when Anne was being courted, it's highly likely that Henry stayed at Penshurst Place and based himself there. Hever is just a matter of about 3 miles away, so very easy to move between the two. And of course, Hever was a small residence, but it was private. And so I think when we do get into this period in Anne's life, when the king is courting her and there's so much going on, this was a great place for the family to retreat in privacy, away from the prying eyes and ears of court.
I think the fact that, I mean, firstly, it's funny to describe a castle as dinky and small, but Hever absolutely is. You know, when you compare it to Penshurst, or you compare it to somewhere like Windsor or Warwick or Arundel, it's a diddy little castle. But it's, to your point, it does feel very private. And actually, the fact that Anne, when things got a bit hot at court in those very early days, the fact that she returned to Hever to essentially lay low, I think tells you a lot about how private this space was, and that really it was a kind of their own little sanctuary in some respects.
And it was buried within the forest at the time. It was surrounded by forest, and as well forest, the forest where no man dwells, because it was known for its lawlessness. So, you could see how it was, a haven, really, a haven of privacy for them. But we shouldn't forget that, in time, Anne was one of the greatest landowners. The Boleyns hold a whole portfolio of properties. And in fact, on the tour, I think I'm absolutely thrilled and over the moon that we've got Professor Simon Thurley joining us on one of our days. And he is one of the most eminent architectural historians and has written one of my favourite books, literally one of my favourite books, Houses of Power. And he's going to talk to us about the Boleyns in Norfolk and the Boleyn property portfolio. And I think we'll learn a lot more about that from Simon, and just sort of realise just how extensive and how wealthy the family were. And then you get much more of a feel that it wasn't just all about Hever. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that day so much, because there's so much going on that one day. The thing that I'm also really excited about is that in addition to Simon Thurley that day, we're having this time with Brigitte Webster, who's, the top of her field Tudor food historian, and she's actually going to be preparing a banquet that Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII had. She's going to be recreating it from scratch, which I think is just remarkable. I mean, that is just such a treat, isn't it?
Oh, it's going to be brilliant. I have had the pleasure of staying with Brigitte at the Old Hall, which is an early 16th century manor house just outside Norwich, which is where we're going to land for the day, enjoy a number of different Tudor pursuits. And yes, Brigitte is going to recreate this feast, and she's got a lovely, hopefully the weather will be really nice, because she's got a lovely outdoor banqueting area overlooking the lake. And you can sit there and just enjoy the history of the place. And the food is phenomenal. And it's so interesting because you're presented with all of these dishes you've never seen or heard of before. And some of them you think, I'm not really sure about this. And then taste it, and it's absolutely delicious. So, yeah, it will be a fantastic day.
I hope there's nothing involving lampreys.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think she'll probably err on the side of caution when it comes to stuff like that. But
I don't want a surfeit of lampreys. I don't want a Henry I situation. Getting back to Hever, I love Hever Castle. Don't you? It's just gorgeous.
I do. What's your favourite thing about it? What do you love going and seeing or lingering over when you visit?
I think the portrait collection is remarkable. I mean, it's so extensive. I think it's one of the things that really makes Hever so prominent. Taking aside all of the Boleyn stuff, just the collection of portraits they have there, really of people from the early Middle Ages right through to the end of the Tudors. It's just a remarkable collection of portraits, which I love. But I also like the fact that it's, as much as, the way it looks now, in many respects, the Boleyns wouldn't recognise, the castle itself is as it looked, and it's it's compact. It's just a beautiful castle. It's kind of like when you're growing up and you have a sort of image in your mind of the sort of fairy tale medieval castle. Hever kind of really ticks a lot of boxes because it's got the moat. It's got the ivy growing up the front of it. It's just so beautiful, and I just think that's a big part of what I love about it, and obviously the huge ties to Anne Boleyn, who is undoubtedly my favourite figure from history.
Yeah, it's a very warm castle, I think. I often try to remember what I first felt when I first visited it in my teens, when I already loved Tudor history. And I think I remember the wonder and the awe of actually stepping into this surviving Tudor house. I didn't appreciate the time. That's, the layout of the rooms had changed to a degree, but actually remarkably, the footprint, as you say, Adam, is remarkably unchanged. Yes, some elements, definitely some rooms have changed their use, that's for sure, and would be, from that point of view, be unrecognisable to the Boleyns. But the actual footprint of the rooms is pretty much unchanged. I think it's a really place to be savoured. I love going there, and obviously my inspiration for my novel about Anne Boleyn, Le Temps Viendra, happened whilst visiting Hever Castle, and so that was a very special time for me, and a very quite emotional time. So I have some really strong ties to particular areas in the castle and memories that come from that day and the 2 years that followed of me writing that novel. So it's quite funny, actually. It's a bit ironic, just shows you that things do change. One of the central parts of the very early story is when modern day Anne passes out and then wakes up back in Anne Boleyn's shoes, and it all happens in the long gallery at the end, the recess at the end. And of course, now we know that the chances are that long gallery actually didn't exist when Anne Boleyn was. It's okay. It's okay. I'm a novelist. It's fine.
There's much bigger inaccuracies in TV dramas about the Tudors.
Exactly.
We can live with it.
Exactly.
As best we know, did Elizabeth spend any time at Hever?
No, I've asked this question, obviously, of Owen Emerson, who used to work at Hever, and also Claire Ridgway. They wrote The Boleyns of Hever, which is a really nice book, actually.
It's great,
if you want to kind of get up to date with kind of the latest thinking on the castle. And the definitive answer is we'd love her to have, but there's no evidence that she did. So I think she came close to on one of her progresses, but there's absolutely no evidence that she did visit. I mean, it's so hard to believe that she didn't, out of just sheer curiosity, right?
I think it's also possible that if she had visited, it might have been at the time that Anne of Cleves occupied it, potentially, because, we know that Anne of Cleves and Elizabeth were quite close, I think, and Hever was one of the many sites that Anne of Cleves got as part of the annulment settlement, and actually, you found a wood panel dating from the time that Anne of Cleves actually owned Hever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was a journey. So, I mean, it is a long story and I don't intend to tell that, but while writing in the footsteps of the 6 wives of Henry VIII and looking at some of Anne Boleyn, the properties associated with Anne, yes, I did come across, along with a team, including Jonathan Foyle and Christine Hill, a local historian in Bedfordshire, we came across a set of panels that had been long been mislabeled, and eventually, through a bit of sleuthing, we identified that they were directly linked to Anne of Cleves, and that they probably adorned one of her high-status private places in one of her dower properties. Difficult to say which one, but yeah, and it's very rare because there's, according to Jonathan Foyle, there's very, very few kind of, if any, real authentic surviving interiors that are particularly related to Henry's queen consort. So it's a real unique survivor. And actually, it's normally on the single panel, because there's a whole set of panels in a church in Bedfordshire, Old Warden Church. But the single panel that came up for auction that eventually got bought by Hever Castle is currently on display in the Six Lives exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, if anybody wants to see that, in the Anne of Cleves section.
Yes. So next time, if you're going to see it, people, when you're looking at that, just know Sarah Morris, the person here today, she discovered that.
Yes, well, my name is inconsequential in terms of the actual importance of the artifact itself.
So I'm just sticking up for you.
I know you are, and it's very, very specific. But the thing is that sometimes I think it's one of those artifacts you could just walk by and really not take it in, but actually it's got a fantastic story behind its rediscovery, which I've written about in the footsteps of the Six Wives of Henry VIII, so you can read all about it there. And also say it's a according to Jonathan Foyle, kind of part of a nationally important historic collection of Tudor interiors.
To discuss the women themselves, Anne and Elizabeth, there is a sort of presiding theory by a lot of people that the moment Elizabeth was born, that this was the beginning of the end for Anne Boleyn. What do you think to that as a theory?
We can have a bit of a debate about this. I'm sure. I mean, I obviously, having written the novel, which I really tried to immerse myself in Anne's life, and when you write, history slows right down because obviously it has to go at the pace that you can read, research, assimilate, and write. So I always felt that when I was writing that novel, history that before had been read at this kind of pace that I'm speaking now, which allows you to kind of jump over the surface, really slowed right down. And I look very closely at this, trying to figure out when it all went horribly wrong. And the bottom line is, I still don't really know. I do think this was an important fracture point. I think that's what I call it. It was a fracture point that severely weakened the relationship, because I think it was the beginning of Henry losing faith in Anne.
Yeah.
And patience. Now, of course, if she'd gone on to have a son, that would all be fine. That would all be put in the past. We would have forgotten all about that. Just a little blip on the radar, but she didn't. And so although I don't think they fell out of love at that stage, because they had this very tempestuous, passionate love-hate relationship as far as I can make out, I think the fracture was there, and then they got close. On the surface, they got closer, and they got close. There were storms.
The sunshine and showers.
Sunshine and showers, that's right. But I think underneath it, the fracture actually did start there, and then, of course, just widened as certain events unfolded later on.
I often describe them as a bit like the Tudor version of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, like that. As in, there's that, it's that sort of can't live with, can't live without. There is so much passion. It's one of the, I maintain that I believe she was the love of Henry VIII's life. I massively disagree with the theory that it was Jane Seymour. I think there is an argument that Catherine of Aragon was more of his youthful first love, but I think as far as the love of his life, I think was Anne. And I think in some respects that can almost be what ended up happening. In a way, adds more weight to that theory, because it's almost like to that point of can't live with, can't live without sort of thing is kind of how I've often felt about Henry and Anne. And I would agree with you. I think that it's a fractious point, and it's that had Elizabeth been a boy, Anne Boleyn would have been absolutely secure, and she would have been absolutely secure had she had a boy 2 years later. It was just, but the fact that Elizabeth was born, and then the fact that Anne didn't give birth to more children, it was the sort of the first big blow, but it wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back. That came later, but this was where it started. I think in many ways.
Yeah. Oh, we agree. Hello.
We totally agree. But there are also lots of. I think it was a blow for Henry and undoubtedly a blow for Anne. But actually, there's quite a lot of signs that Anne in particular, doted on Elizabeth, isn't there? I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain she wanted to breastfeed Elizabeth, which was something that was deemed hugely inappropriate in a queen.
Yeah, I definitely remember that. And I think she had her on for a period of time, there was one account of her having her on a cushion beside her throne. So Yeah, she seems to have an unusually, well, not unusual, but let's put it this way. I never thought Anne would be such a natural mother. I'm quite
Right.
surprised at just how she took to that role, but she totally did, didn't she? She was
Mm,
fiercely protective and bonded to Elizabeth, and in such a touching way, really. And I think, we see more evidence of that. Of all that, she took a lot of interest in Elizabeth. There are letters writing about where Elizabeth is going to set up her, sort of a household. There's records of her ordering material for garments for her daughter. And of course, we certainly know that when she could, and I expect she wanted to do this more than she was able, visiting Elizabeth at places like Hatfield and Eltham. So
mm.
I think she would have loved to have spent more time with her. And it's tragic, really, isn't it, that she got to spend so little time with the one
Yeah.
thing in her world that was probably unconditionally bonded to her.
Yeah, the purest thing.
Mm.
I think we should also, is there an element, if playing devil's advocate a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, is there an element that having her on that cushion by her side, it was a way of also reminding Henry at all times, I am fertile. You've got, yes, she's a girl, but she's undoubtedly yours. Look at the hair. Was it a way of Anne also reminding Henry that, yes, this little girl is a girl, and I'm sorry about that, but she is your daughter, and it's living proof that I can provide you with children. That might have been a bit there as well, potentially.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think that's a really good point. So yeah, well said. I mean, Anne was politically astute, wasn't she?
Mm,
Until the last few months of her life, when I think emotionally she lost the plot a bit, and I think her kind of political savviness deserted her.
yes.
But I think not at that stage. So she was still very much a woman who knew how to maneuver Henry, shall we
Yeah.
say?
Play the game.
Yeah.
Another site we're visiting on the tour is Eltham Palace. It's somewhere I've never been. I'm looking forward to that very much. Sadly, a lot of the Tudor is lost to us at Eltham Palace. But what are the ties there between Anne and Elizabeth?
So Eltham had been a very much favoured palace, medieval palace. It was much beloved by the Yorkists. Edward IV, I think, put a lot of money into Eltham. But then by the Tudor period, it was less used as a royal palace, more as a royal nursery. And that's really where Elizabeth comes into this. We know that she spent time at Eltham. Of course, it wasn't far from Greenwich, so that's quite nice. You've got the main court at Greenwich, and then not far away, you have Eltham. And we know that Anne visited Elizabeth at Eltham and spent time with her daughter. We also know that's where one of the very fiery incidents with Mary Tudor took place, where they encountered each
Mm,
other in the chapel, and Mary curtsied, and Anne thought that she was finally paying reverence to her as queen, and sent a message to thank her. And Mary sent a really rather rude retort to say it was not to her, but to her, basically to her God. And yeah, I think that was
yeah.
that was Anne trying to extend the olive branch of peace yet again, and having it stuffed firmly back down her throat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Mary Tudor, I don't know. She had a nerves of steel, really, didn't she?
Oh, massively. Yeah. I have a lot of respect for her.
Yeah,
Um,
hard life.
yeah, massively so. So we cannot have a conversation about Anne and Elizabeth and not discuss the Tower of London. Sadly, I think it's one of the biggest losses is, the royal apartments at the Tower of London that Anne occupied prior to her coronation and prior to her execution. We've lost the Great Hall that was once at the Tower of London. Do we know, well, from your own research and sort of your understanding of the tower, the rooms that Anne occupied, did Elizabeth occupy those same rooms prior to her coronation, or was she lodged somewhere else?
Pretty sure she did. And actually,
Okay,
gosh, I might be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure that that's where she stayed when she was a prisoner in the tower as well.
right, okay. That would make sense.
I've heard it
Yeah.
makes sense. Or is that just conjecture? Not on my part, but I'm sure that that is the sort of working hypothesis, because, of course, she was a royal princess, and it would have been gosh, can you imagine being held there as a prisoner, knowing that the last woman of note to be held in those rooms was your mother, and look what happened to
Yeah,
her?
it must have been pretty frightening. Yeah, and those apartments were
Imagine.
unusual, weren't they? Because they were actually bigger than the king's apartments, which was really rare, right?
Very, yeah, very. I mean, obviously, the normal arrangement would be that the king's side would be grander, larger than the queen's side to reflect his status.
Mm,
But yes, at the Tower, because the apartments were refurbished specifically for Anne, and of course, at that time, Henry was completely besotted and he wanted to underline the fact that Anne Boleyn was his true wife and queen consort. He obviously went above and beyond and created these lavish apartments, which were grander, in fact, than those allotted to the king at the time. So yeah, quite unusual.
mm.
But sadly, of course, we ain't got nothing left of them.
It's so frustrating, isn't it? I mean, what happened there? Did they get when did they get torn down?
It wasn't that long after, because I think I'm right in saying I think the first Stuart king was the last king to process from the Tower. You're going to have to forgive me if I've got that wrong, but it was around about that time.
James the First.
Yeah, and you know, I suppose Elizabeth didn't have much of an appetite for the place because of what had happened to her mother there and her memories of being imprisoned there. And it just sort of fell from favour. And once it
Yeah,
had fallen from favour, nobody was looking after it. And I think it quite quickly fell into a state of disrepair. I mean, we're talking, you know, within 100 years or so, it was in a terrible state of disrepair, and was eventually sort of just dismantled, really.
yeah. I do know that what is now the Queen's house, which is the bit to the left of the Chapel of St. Peter, is the Queen's house is the name, isn't it? The bit to the left of the Chapel of St. Peter. That is where I think Lady Jane Grey was held before her execution, which would suggest that even by that point, the old apartments weren't being used for royal guests. I think I'm right there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I suppose Jane maybe wasn't deemed to be as, you know, obviously she, you know, there's arguments about this, isn't there? Was she a real queen? Was she not? You know, and all the rest of it. But maybe Mary was wanting to make the point that she didn't see that she was legitimate and therefore was not going to house her in what had deemed to be the royal apartments, and kind of was trying to underline her state as the usurper that she was.
Yeah. Off topic, but what do you think? Do you think she should be known as Queen Jane?
Yeah, I think she probably should actually. I mean, it was official for that period of time. And
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, I think my inclination is to say yes.
Yes, I would agree. And the reason for that, the argument that a lot of people say is she was never crowned, which is true. But,
Mm.
the moment the late Queen Elizabeth II died and her son became King Charles III, we didn't start calling him King Charles III from May 6th, 2023 onwards, aka the day that he was crowned. He was King Charles from the moment the Queen died.
Yes, and also, Adam, there were several Tudor queens that weren't
Yeah,
crowned.
exactly.
It was only Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon that were crowned, but we still called Jane Seymour, Catherine Parr, and of Cleves. We still call them
Yeah,
Queen. So I think that is genuinely erroneous to think of it in that way.
yeah, agreed. I think, yeah, I think of her as Queen Jane. So, something that a lot of people may not know about Elizabeth's time in the Tower of London as a prisoner is that she was released on the 19th of May, the anniversary of her mum's execution. Now, surely this was a deliberate bitchy move from Queen Mary. I mean, it cannot be a coincidence, can it?
I suppose it technically could be, but I tend to think it was just a sick joke, basically.
Yeah, it must have
I
been.
mean, it's just, can you imagine? You're in your apartments on the 19th of May. You surely know that's the date that your mother was executed. And the
Yeah,
guards arrive at your door.
yeah. I bet she was not in a good place.
And to sort of, you think, what they come for me for? You know, and where they're going to take me. And anyway, yes,
Yeah,
she was under house arrest, of course. But yes, she was.
yeah.
She left the tower on that day. Yeah. Naughty, naughty Mary. That's all I can say.
Yeah, and naughty Margaret Douglas as well, because I don't think it was the Tower. I think it was at Hampton Court But I know that when Elizabeth was under house arrest prior to be taken to the Tower, her apartments were directly below Margaret Douglas's apartments. And Margaret Douglas, when she found out about this, deliberately had all of her apartments refurbished really loudly overnight to ensure that Elizabeth didn't get any sleep. What a bitch.
I didn't know that. Oh, dear me. Yeah, no.
Yeah, because Margaret Douglas was obviously very fond of and very close to Mary. So she when she found out that Elizabeth was being held directly below her apartments, she immediately went to work having her own apartments totally refitted and insisted it being done throughout the night, so it stopped Elizabeth getting any sleep.
Yeah, right. Well, let's strike her off the invite list, shall we?
So in 1873, Anne Boleyn's remains were uncovered and examined for the first time at the Chapel of St. Peter, and they were uncovered alongside several other people at the time. Sadly, the remains of Catherine Howard, it was believed that they'd just turned to dust because of her youth and the fact that she was interred with limestone. But Anne Boleyn's remains were uncovered. What happened on that day? Do you know much about it?
I know, if I can remember, because I wrote quite a detailed blog about this. Yeah, it's an interesting tale, and we really only have this because the chapel was again in a terrible state of repair, and the chancel pavement was collapsing because obviously over the centuries the tower was like a little mini citadel, and it was home to many different types of people who lived there continuously. St. Peter's, the Chapel of St. Peter Vincula was like the parish church for the tower, so people worshipped there, people were buried there. And over the years there had been several layers of burial under the pavement, and of course as the coffins rotted and collapsed, so did the pavement collapse with it. So I think initially it was hoped that they could just repair without really excavating, but it became really obvious that no, they needed to do something a little bit more radical, and that's when they decided that they were going to excavate that area directly in front of the high altar, and they did so. There was a whole posse of the great and the good came along to watch the kind of disinterment of the remains and to oversee them, and they were examined by the kind of forensic pathologist of the time, who wrote some pretty detailed accounts of the skeletons that he found there. But of course, sadly, he didn't have all of the modern technology that we have that perhaps would have allowed us to do facial reconstructions and all sorts of interesting things. Take DNA, who knows whether there'd be any DNA left at that point. But hey, they managed to get something off Richard. No, they didn't get it off. Where did they get Richard III's DNA from? Did they take it from his skeleton and then match it to his Australian relative? I can't remember.
Yeah, no, it must have been, because the guy that they found, they actually found a couple of relatives, and it's only the guy that's featured in the documentary, because then he was a coffin maker, and he built the coffin that Richard's bones were then reinterred into. But they actually found two people. Yeah. There was a woman as well, that they tested her DNA against the bones, and there was a match there as well. But yeah, that would have been bone DNA testing. So yeah, I mean, if we were to uncover Anne's remains or the bones that are said to be Anne Boleyn, then yes, there could be some testing done, and what she maybe truly looked like. One aspect of the findings, it was a Dr. Frederick Mout, I think is the pronunciation of the surname, and I know that Queen Victoria was really interested in it. One of the things that he says is that the bones were belonged to a woman of between 25 and 30, which, if you believe 1507 like I do, adds a bit of weight.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it, to know and how accurate.
But it was Victorian.
Yeah, you know. It's Victorian science. I mean, that's the frustrating thing, you know. Oh my goodness, if we could get hold of those bones today, they could tell us so much more. I'd love to see a facial reconstruction, because I think they just would be awesome. But anyway, of course, they didn't have that. So what I think a fact that a lot of people may not know is that the bones weren't dug up and then replaced straight away. They were actually put into boxes and kept in the constable's house, you know, the kind of the Lord Lieutenant of the Tower, for about, I think, about 3 or 4 months. Or maybe even more, but several months they were kept above ground before they were finally had done the repairs to the chapel, and that they put them in these boxes and I think they put the names of who they thought were in the boxes and then reburied them, cement, and there you go. And then put those lovely tiles. And at least we have those lovely tiles. But of course, as you were hinting at there, Adam, we don't absolutely 100% know who is who. Or best guesses, really.
Yeah, I mean, Alison Weir is of the belief that the bones found to be Anne Boleyn, she thinks, are probably more likely to be Jane Boleyn, and that the bones that were Jane Boleyn could be Catherine Howard. I think that's what she landed on. But most people, based on the descriptions, and also there was this, something passed down through the annals of time that the burials were organised in such a way that there were 2 dukes between 2 queens, and and that holds out because it would appear to hold out because the remains found in order were Anne Boleyn, and then you had Edward Seymour, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, and then to his direct right there were the remains where Catherine Howard would have been buried, but they found nothing. And the belief there was that was because she was so young when she was executed, and they found limestone in the ground, that it just turned her bones to dust. And then they found 2 more. They found the remains of 2 more women, one of which is believed to be Jane Boleyn, and the other Margaret Pole, because the bones that they think belonged to Margaret Pole were described as quite a tall woman of very advanced years, and she is the only person that sort of fits that description who would have been buried with some because this is the other thing that's, you know, even though these people were executed as traitors, they were buried with a bit more deference than your average Joe, which I think is part of the reason why we're able to also ascertain who they potentially could be. They weren't just thrown in a mass pit like the sort of more lowly people who died and were buried at the Tower.
I take it that you've been into the chapel and you've stood there in front of those graves.
Yeah, I've never been able to get up close. I've always been, so I'm looking forward to that being something that we can do this September in a couple of months' time. Yeah. I've not been able to actually step onto it, but I'm really looking forward to it, and it's a beautiful spot.
Absolutely.
As well. Yeah, and whilst we think of it, just for anyone listening, that spot outside the Chapel of St. Peter, where there's a lovely glass memorial saying this is the spot where the executions took place. Sadly, that's wrong, isn't it, Sarah?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. It's all very nice and all very pretty and all the rest of it, but you need to think of the parade ground in front of the Waterloo Barracks to get the correct spot for the scaffold.
Yeah. So roughly speaking, where people queue up to go into the crown jewels, that is roughly speaking where the scaffold would have been.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget that green area in front of the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was the graveyard initially for the chapel. So there are probably hundreds of bodies buried underneath there, including, of course, the men that died along with Anne that weren't of noble status. Yeah,
absolutely.
Although sadly, we don't know any more than that.
So somewhere else we're visiting on the tour that has huge ties, not necessarily with Anne, but absolutely with Elizabeth, is Hatfield House. Do you think that in many ways it was kind of the closest thing that Elizabeth had when she was young to a home, an actual home?
I really do. I call this in my blog the cradle of the Elizabethan age, because I think of all the properties. And again, as a young princess, Elizabeth moved around to a number of different properties. We've already talked about Eltham, but she spent a lot of time at Hatfield. And we do know that later in her teenage years, she wrangled the property. I think it was when her half-brother Edward came to the throne. Another noble person, I can't remember who it was, had their eyes on it, and Elizabeth managed to pitch and get her hands on Hatfield. She wanted that place. She spent a lot of time there. She grew up there. She faced all sorts of difficulties, during Mary's reign. when she was arrested, or, her cat Ashley, they were dragged to the tower for questioning. She was dragged, it was a place that a lot had happened there, but she retreated to it. Eventually, after she got out of house arrest, she went back to Hatfield. She made it her home. She was there when Mary died. And, obviously that's when she found out she was going to be queen. And I think it held a really important place in her heart. And I think that's the place that she considered of everywhere home.
The main site that a lot of people, the site that you can walk around now that's, packed full of portraits, it features in the film Elizabeth the Golden Age, is the newer part. And it was actually the old palace at Hatfield that had its real ties to Elizabeth. And am I right in thinking it was in the old palace that she actually held her very first council meeting, almost from the moment that she found out that she was queen?
Yeah, absolutely. So legend has it, doesn't it, that she hears that she's queen in the park under the oak tree. But yes, she is in residence at Hatfield. There wasn't the new Jacobean prodigy manor house that we see there today. That's just very close to, but didn't exist during Elizabeth's time there. We have this lovely red brick palace that was essentially belonged to the bishopric of Ely, and a lot of the aggrandisement of that palace had been conducted by John Morton, who was one point Bishop of Ely, became Lord Chancellor for Henry VII and his Archbishop of Canterbury. He did a lot to aggrandise the palace, and that was the palace that Elizabeth would have known, which was basically you had a double courtyard, your outer gatehouse, your outer courtyard, and then from the outer courtyard directly accessing the main palace building, which was 4 ranges built around a central courtyard. And that is the palace that Elizabeth would have known. And in the Great Hall there, I think it's in the Great Hall, if I remember correctly, that's where it's said that she held her first council meeting. So really, important spot. And we're so lucky, although much of that old palace has gone, the outer gatehouse survives, the outer courtyard survives, and the range, including the Great Hall, still survives. So we're really lucky we've got some of it, because the other 3 ranges at some point, including what would have been Elizabeth's privy lodgings overlooking the beautiful gardens, unfortunately, they have been lost. But we can still go and stand in the Great Hall. And in fact, we're going to be meeting Elizabeth, are we not, when we are going to Hatfield? One of the treats I find to help us time travel in our mind is to meet reenactors who do first person stuff. And one of the best of these is Leslie Smith, who's the curator of Tutbury Castle. And she I think is probably has the reputation of being one of the finest reenactors, and we are going to be meeting her in an audience with Elizabeth I. Hopefully, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we can do that in the Great Hall, and she will be we'll have a chance to really just let our imaginations run wild as she takes us back in time and hopefully reminisces with us what Hatfield was like for her and some of the events that unfolded at Hatfield. And I think that was going to be awesome. I'm so looking forward to that.
Yeah, I am. It's going to be so cool. And she's not actually the only person we've got on the tour. We're also meeting earlier in the week. We're meeting with David Smith, aka Sir Loyal Heart, who is a full-time Henry VIII impersonator. And it's remarkable what he's doing. He's totally embodies Henry VIII, and he's going to be presiding over a private banquet that we're hosting in the Great Hall of Hever Castle. So it's going to be great seeing, father and daughter at different ends of the week, as it were.
Yeah, I hope we get a chance to ask them questions, because that's a really fun thing to do.
Yeah,
and see what you get back. I think you start to get this real sense. I remember doing, just as a very aside for a moment, for a podcast, an interview. It was a blog I did an interview with Henry VIII at Hampton Court Palace, one of the Henry VIII reenactors. And it was so spooky because he was so good at staying in role. I really felt like, I had my kind of lump in my throat, and I felt that sense of just being awed in being in his presence. And that's knowing he was a reenactor. So Goodness knows what it must have been like to actually come before the real Henry VIII.
I think it would have been pretty frightening, I think.
So, yeah.
Something I'd like to also discuss is how the mood softened around Anne Boleyn by the time we hit Elizabeth I's reign. What are, one of the things that I think is a sign that things have definitely changed is at Elizabeth's coronation procession, because wasn't there a tableau created essentially en route that showed it was sort of three-tiered, had Elizabeth of York and Henry VII at the bottom, and then I think in the middle was Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and then Elizabeth above or below. So that was a sort of life-size one. I'd love to have seen it. I mean, imagine if that had survived. But am I right in thinking that was a thing that was created for Elizabeth's coronation?
Yeah, I think so. I don't remember the details of that, but I do remember that was there, and that the image of Anne was present at that coronation. It was such a significant event. So there's another one of those, isn't there, where there's links between mother and daughter, where Elizabeth is absolutely making the point that it's sort of quietly, but not quietly. I mean, you can't really have a tableau being in the middle of London, in the middle of a coronation procession with a life-size figure of her parents being that quiet. But at the same time, she's not having to say any words. It's just there. And it almost speaks 1,000 words, doesn't it?
And I think that also we also then see that in other quiet ways with regard to Elizabeth. And I think a big thing that we have to discuss is the Chequers ring. It's one of we believe one of Elizabeth I's treasured possessions. It's a piece of jewelry. It's a ring, and it's a ring that opens up to reveal tiny portraits of Elizabeth and another woman who surely is Anne, right? What do you think?
And I've interviewed a couple of people like Professor Susan Doran about this, and every historian, like Tracy Borman, every historian I've spoken to thinks it's Anne, and dismisses the other alternative, which is Catherine Parr.
Or Elizabeth when she was younger. Is there something else? Yeah.
Yeah, or Elizabeth when she was younger. I think they're both reasonably compelling arguments, and she just looks like Anne.
Yeah, it's definitely Anne. I mean, I saw it in person at the there was an exhibition at the British Library 2 or 3 years ago about Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots, and I think the thing that blew my mind was just how small it is. It's tiny.
In a way, it's a little bit underwhelming, isn't it? Because it is so small. I don't know what I was expecting, some huge, great big rock, spotlighted. But it is absolutely minuscule. I suppose if you could have a chance to pick it up and put it on your finger, it might feel a bit more exciting.
Yeah. But I mean, the faces are smaller than your little fingernail. Yeah. I mean, they're just tiny. I mean, that's the thing that blew my mind, was just how small it is.
I wonder what it's worth. I'd love to know, wouldn't you?
Oh, could you imagine? Well, I mean, the fact that portrait of Catherine Parr that came up a little while, I think it sold for like 3.6 million. So I dread to think how much it's worth. A lot. It's probably
yes.
the best conclusion. And on the subject of sort of Elizabeth wearing things or these sort of sly shows of support of her mother, another thing that's probably worth us discussing is the family of Henry VIII portrait, which is housed at Hampton Court Palace. And it's something you would miss quite easily. But Elizabeth appears to be wearing a pendant around her neck with a letter A hanging from it. What do you do you think it is, or what are your thoughts on that?
It definitely looks like that, absolutely. And what other conclusion can you draw that A stands for Anne? I can't think of what else it would be. And again, yes, that is a really rather touching, quiet connection to her mother. And we all talk about the bee necklace, don't we? Which, by the way, Charlotte Bolland of the NPG has a very interesting, if not very controversial, theory that actually, the bee pendant that's on the very famous picture of Anne Boleyn, which was painted after her lifetime. One of her theories is that actually that is a later recreation and didn't actually exist as such. And the bee, she wouldn't have worn a bee. So anyway, you'll have to listen to my podcast. I'm putting it out the next week or two if you want to hear Charlotte talk about that. But I thought, gosh, that's putting the cat among the pigeons, because so many people email me saying, what happened to Anne Boleyn's B pendant? What happened if there wasn't one?
Yeah, I think what we should think about with that is that if there were one, she would have wore it before getting married, because once she was married, she was technically Anne Tudor, really. So had such a thing existed, it probably wouldn't have been something she wore once she became queen.
Yeah, and yet this portrait is painted, supposedly, of her during that period of her life. So anyway, I thought it was quite interesting, controversial, but so maybe we should be asking, where is the A pendant rather than where is the B pendant?
Yeah. People come up with, I mean, I was shooketh a little while ago. I was chatting to Illyri Lynn, and she thinks there's some weight behind the Anne and George accusations.
Oh my goodness, no, really?
Which I was like, that is a big claim. And she basically said, look, I don't think they did. She said, but I think it's entirely possible that it was considered between the two in a moment of desperation. And I said, I wholeheartedly disagree. Sorry, Illyri, I think you're wonderful, but I think you're very wrong in that one respect.
Oh God, yeah, that is the one thing that I just think did not happen.
Yeah.
Just did not happen.
Definitely.
Anyway, interesting. It's good to put the cat among the pigeons now and again. It gets a good argument going anyway.
Oh, totally. And it's, I think that a lot of people would, well, I mean, the whole Anne Boleyn's date of birth thing is it's letting off a little Tudor bomb every time you raise it. I mean, and in particular, the fact that now 1504 has been thrown into the mix by some people as well. It's an Anne Boleyn thing we'll never get to the bottom of, I think, unless something big turns up, but who knows. Final thing that I would like to sort of ask your opinion on, your theory is, and we touched on it earlier, why Elizabeth didn't have Anne reburied in a grander setting. Do you have any thoughts on why that might have been?
I think it just, the saying that comes to mind for me is just let sleeping dogs lie. It's I think the closest I can come to, because I genuinely believed that Elizabeth thought a lot of her mother. And it is really difficult to fathom out why she wouldn't have had her reburied, if not for sort of broader political ramifications. And maybe it was enough for her to have her mother's pendant, to have her mother's image in her ring, to quietly, to sit opposite the Boleyn Chantry Chapel quietly. Maybe she felt it was enough and that she didn't need any grand gesture to the outside world that might kind of unsettle her own position or how she was viewed. And I guess maybe that was just enough for her. But we're all screaming, aren't we, 500 years in the future? Why didn't you have her reburied in Westminster Abbey and put up a lovely effigy so that we could go and see it?
Yeah, I mean, that I think that's what it comes down to is, why didn't you do this? But then I think also, am I right in thinking that the Chapel of St. Peter is technically, it's a royal chapel because the Tower of London is a palace?
It's a Royal Peculiar, isn't it? I think.
Royal Peculiar, yes. So she is therefore buried in a royal chapel. She's buried as a queen. So maybe, it wasn't like she was just lumped in anywhere.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a part of it as well.
Yeah, maybe. Again,
it would have been, it would be wonderful to have had a big grand burial at Westminster with an effigy. That would have been fantastic to be able to see. But sadly, not the case. And not the case for Mary either. She got buried underneath Elizabeth. I'm so sorry for Mary in that regard.
Yes, I know. That is, and she doesn't have any. She just has that plaque that they've put there. Basically saying
she's in it
somewhere near this spot. She's around here somewhere, basically. Yeah, that's another one. That she didn't make any decent provision for herself, but obviously Elizabeth wasn't minded to make anything of it. In fact, it's funny, isn't it? We've got Mary without a decent tomb. We've got Henry without a decent tomb. We've got, some real giants of the Tudor age. And Edward, he's just got a plaque on the floor. He was buried in a very shallow grave at the foot of of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Yeah. So they didn't do a very good job, really, in memorialising themselves.
Yeah, I do know with Henry that he had a plan, and he wanted to.
Oh, he did.
He wanted to be buried beneath a huge marble statue of him on a horse, but essentially his kids couldn't afford it, so which is why I think it never got done.
Yeah, nobody could afford it, and kind of appetite just didn't seem to be there. You are really reliant, aren't you, on the people that are still behind to memorialise you properly.
And his burial, I mean, it's one of those things about St George's Chapel, Windsor, that you would easily overlook. I mean, it's smack bang in the middle of the altar, but you could easily walk over it. I'm sure many people do walk over it without realising who they're walking over.
Yeah.
Which is kind of satisfying in a way, given what
I love it. I purposely, I know, maybe I'm going to be condemned for this, but at the end of writing my novel, when I'd lived for 2 years with Henry VIII up close and personal, I purposely went to St George's Chapel and I stood in front of the high altar and I purposely walked right over him. With a great sense of satisfaction.
Yeah.
And see you, Henry.
Yeah, laters.
Poor Henners.
Cool. Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on for a chat. This has been really fun, and hopefully people will get a lot from it. And if you're listening in, there are spots still available on the Anne and Elizabeth tour that sort of underpins this conversation. You can find out more about that on simplytudortours.com. And yeah, thanks again, Sarah, for coming on for a chat.
You're welcome. Hopefully we'll see some of your listeners in person and visiting some of these places for themselves. That would be so much fun. Anyway, thanks for having me, Adam.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks to Sarah for coming on for a chat, and to you, my listeners, for tuning in. If you would like to discover more about the upcoming tours that we're running, please head over to our website, simplytudortours.com. Next week, I'm going to be welcoming Dr. James Taff back onto the podcast, this time for a chat all about his latest book, Serving the Tudors, which, as you can probably guess, is about the people who were below stairs, actually serving the Tudor nobility and royalty. If you enjoy the podcast, then perhaps you would consider signing up to my Patreon or Apple Podcast subscriptions, where you can find weekly additional subscriber-only episodes from as little as £5 a month. Thank you again for listening to the show, and speak soon.